Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. Biggest question about this 2022 NBA draft. Is it fair to have concerns about Chet Holmgren? And so it's interesting, right? I talked about this on Monday's show, Shaedon Sharpe. We'll talk a little bit about Shaedon Sharpe. But I did a big segment on Shaedon Sharpe on Monday, and a big crux of it was that last week I was at the Pangos All-American High School Camp, which is a high school basketball All-American camp that NBA scouts are allowed at. I love to go to this event because you see a lot of the best high school players in America, which become great college players, which then become great NBA players. I've seen Trae Young there. I've seen Jonathan Kuminga there. I've seen Michael Porter there. I've seen Hamidou Diallo there. I've seen Lonzo Ball there, on and on and on and on and on. What's great about this event, though, is that it is a high school event where NBA personnel are allowed. And one thing that is great is that I can pick the brains of a bunch of NBA people in the building at the same time rather than get everybody on the phone, whatever. And so when I saw my NBA buddies, when I was talking to them, one big question that I kept asking them was about Chet Holmgren. Not, is your team going to pick him? My question was, am I crazy to have questions about him? We all know Chet Holmgren, 7'1", Gonzaga, 190 pounds, doesn't weigh anything. And it was one of those things where I kept going back to this. I have real concerns about him. But is it just me spending too much time on social media, people that don't know what they're talking about, overanalyzing this guy, watching him one time in the tournament and saying he'll never play in the NBA? Or do actual NBA people have the same questions about Chet Holmgren? Do they have the same concerns that he is going to be a guy that either never develops, never puts on weight, never gets to where he needs to be? Well, what I can tell you is definitively this. I talked to a handful of NBA people, and they all told me, Torres, you are not crazy. We all have the same concerns about him. Now, to be clear, Chet Holmgren's awesome, okay? And to be clear, by the way, Chet Holmgren has always been skinny, and it has never really affected him as he has moved up different levels of basketball. And that includes this last year at Gonzaga, where he averaged 14 points per game, 10 rebounds, shot 39% from three, and had 4 blocks. And as I've talked about many times, I saw him in person twice in back-to-back games. And the 2 games that I saw him against, UCLA in November, and then I saw him against Duke later in the week. And it was really interesting because you kind of saw the best and worst of him in those 2 games. Against UCLA, he was awesome. He controlled the paint. He ran the floor, 15 points, 2 of 4 from 3, all that good stuff. And then the second game against Duke kind of got pushed around a little bit by Mark Williams, who we'll talk about in a minute, Duke center. And so I bring it all up to say I have seen the good about Chet and I've seen the bad about Chet, and I wanted to ask NBA people, am I okay? Does it make sense for me to be concerned about them? And the universal answer was yes, and all I will say is a lot like I said about Shaedon Sharpe the other day. The same questions that you and I have about Chet Holmgren, NBA people have about him too. Is he ever going to put on weight? How long is it going to take? How long is it going to take for him to physically be able to handle playing in the NBA? I know we all want to use Kevin Durant as the extreme of, well, Kevin Durant did it and he's still skinny. Kevin Durant averaged 25 points a game at Texas as a freshman, okay? Kevin Durant is a once-in-a-lifetime guy, and we have a lot more examples of other guys that were super skinny that either took a long time to put on weight, took a long time to get adjusted to the physicality and the size and the strength of NBA players, and some guys that just never made it. Now, the good news is there are guys that do eventually put on weight. Giannis is the most obvious one. I think he's probably put on 50, 60 pounds of muscle at this point. But what I will say is there are some concerns about Chet. Now, the good news for Chet is actually in a very advantageous position where he is a guy that's probably going to take 2-3 years to really develop into the NBA player that people want him to be if he ever gets there. But at number 2 and number 3, there are 2 teams that are willing to wait. The Oklahoma City Thunder, they are in like year 3 or 4 of this rebuild, but Sam Presti, it seems as though he's got a lot of leeway. It seems as though he has trust from the ownership, and it seems as though if he wants to take a flyer on a long-term project like Chet Holmgren, he will be allowed to. Houston, it's the same deal. They're in year 2 of a rebuild. They're just trying to get good players. And so I don't see the scenario where Chet Holmgren falls past number 3. But what I will tell you, it's the same thing I told you about Shaedon Sharpe the other day. There are legitimate questions about him. And I went to Pangos All-American camp wondering, am I absolutely crazy for having these questions about Chet Holmgren? And the answer appears to be no. Number 3, in terms of the most fascinating questions heading into the 2022 NBA draft, are the Sacramento Kings at number 4 an inflection point in this entire NBA draft? And here's what I mean. Sacramento is the most fascinating team in this draft, and really the draft can go in a million different directions thanks to Sacramento. The question is why? Well, Orlando, number 1 overall. You haven't been in the playoffs in forever. You got to go get yourself the best player that you think can help you win. Oklahoma City, Houston, they're in total rebuild mode. And so for those two teams, it seems pretty obvious. Take the guy that you think is the best, take the guy that you think will lead to the most success, and we're going to give you time to figure it out. And if this guy doesn't average 20 and 10 as a rookie, that's perfectly fine. Sacramento, though, is a completely different deal. Sacramento has not made the playoffs since 2006. I could be mistaken. It's certainly the longest streak in the NBA. I believe it's the longest streak in the 4 major sports. Just for some perspective, the New York Jets have made the playoffs twice since the last time Sacramento Kings made it. So it has been a long time. And the Sacramento Kings have basically a win now edict from their ownership. I've been on a bunch of Kings podcasts and radio shows and all that stuff. And the Kings are tired of losing. The ownership is tired of losing. And especially now that there's these play-in games, the owner is like, guys, we got to get ourselves into the top 10. You can't get me into the top 10. You got to get me into the top 10. And so the Kings are drafting this year kind of with the understanding, if we don't get in the playoffs next year, we're probably all getting fired. And so why the Kings become the inflection point of the 2022 NBA draft is pretty straightforward. It's because they could go in a million different directions. They could go with the player that most fits what they need right now, because, again, the goal is to make the playoffs. And if that's the case, it's probably Iowa's Keegan Murray. They have a star point guard in De'Aaron Fox. They have an all-star caliber player down low in Domantas Sabonis. The one thing they need is kind of a role player, a guy that can fit a spot, a guy that can do certain things, and that's probably who Keegan Murray is. On the flip side, they could go in another different direction too. They could go with the best available player. Is that Jaden Ivy? The question in Sacramento right now becomes, can Jaden Ivy, the guard from Purdue, play with De'Aaron Fox? The bigger question becomes, does it really matter? Do you just take the best player and it doesn't matter, and you figure out either how to play with those two guys together, or if one of them turns into a star, you can always trade one, right? A few years ago, Sacramento drafted Tyrese Halliburton. He was the best guard available at the time. A lot like De'Aaron Fox, he ended up trading Tyrese Halliburton for Domantas Sabonis in the first place. Is this the landing spot for Shaedon Sharpe? Is another question that's going on in Sacramento right now. Do we say, who cares about getting a guy that can fit right now? If we believe that Shaedon Sharpe is maybe the best player or two in this draft, do we reach on him on the upside? And so to me, the Kings are fascinating because the Kings could go in a million different directions. The last part of it, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that the Kings trade this pick. Again, Orlando needs good players right now. I don't think they're trading the number 1 pick. Houston and Oklahoma City are in rebuild mode. It doesn't make sense for them to take on older veteran players. The Kings need to win immediately. And so if they get an opportunity to trade that number 4 pick for somebody that could help them now, that's also a possibility. I just bring it up to say the Kings are fascinating at number 4. Number 4 question of the top 10 questions of the 2022 NBA draft. Here's the next one. The Pistons at number 5. Are they one piece away from being the Memphis Grizzlies? And here's what I mean by that. So in the NBA, if you get the right young players, it flips really quick, right? The Memphis Grizzlies went from the 9th seed in the 2020 bubble to 18 months later, they were the number 2 seed in this year's playoffs. 9th seed in the bubble, 8th seed last year in the playoffs. Now they were the number 2 seed, and it was all because they nailed like 7 draft picks in a row. Nailed Ja Morant. Then they nailed Jaren Jackson. Then they got a couple late firsts, early seconds in Desmond Bane and Brandon Clark. And all of a sudden you have a young, dynamic, fantastic core that gets you the number 2 seed in the playoffs. And so I'm not saying the Detroit Pistons are there, but I don't think they're that far away either. First of all, ended up with the number 1 pick in last year's draft. They got Cade Cunningham, friend of the Aaron Torres podcast, by the way. Cade was everything that he was expected to be. 17.5 points, 5.5 rebounds, 5.5 assists per game. On top of that, Saddiq Bey, who you drafted in the 2020 COVID draft, has already turned into a star, averaged 16 points per game. Isaiah Stewart, who was a late first, early second round pick in that 2020 COVID draft. I think he was the COVID draft. He might have been the year before. I can't remember. He has turned into a very productive player. And so you now have 3 really good players that you have drafted in the last 2 years. And as I said, I think they are 1 pick away from being absolutely fascinating in terms of this the future of this organization. And so it becomes, if they nail this pick, again, I'm not saying they're winning the NBA title next year, but could you see the scenario where they go from wherever they finish this year to the 8th seed, to a 3 seed a year or 2 from now? I think I could see it. And the crazy thing about the Pistons, what makes them so interesting, is that because of who Cade Cunningham is, I really think they could draft just about anybody, and that guy could step in and have success. And here's why. Because Cade is one of the most unique young players in the league. Yes, he has the ball in his hands, but he's not a guy looking for 30 shots a game. If he gets 8 points per game but 12 assists and that team wins, Cade is happy. He talked about it on this podcast. And so I just bring it up because when I look at the Pistons, they could go in so many different directions. They could go get Jaden Ivy, the guard from Purdue, who's better off the ball than on it, and he could just all of a sudden be a 16, 17-point-a-game guy. They could get Johnny Davis from Wisconsin. They could get Ben Matherin. They could get Keegan Murray. If one of the Paolo, Chet, Jabari guys falls, they could go get him, and they all fit with Cade Cunningham. So I think the inflection point in this draft is the Sacramento Kings. But you talk about fascinating. You talk about an organization that could go from top 5 to the fringes of the playoffs pretty quick. I think the Detroit Pistons are there. They pick at number 5. Number 6 question on today's show. Actually, it's number 5. Number 1 was, should Jabari Smith be the number 1 pick? Number 2, concerns about Chet. Number 3, Sacramento Kings. Number 4, Detroit Pistons. Number 5, who is the most undervalued player in the draft? And I'll say this. I think it's Johnny Davis from Wisconsin, and it's really fascinating, right? Because the way that we evaluate players now, it starts at just a ridiculously young age. Like I can tell you right now that your favorite NBA team has a book on the top high school players that are sophomores and juniors in high school right now. Might not be extensive. They might not have seen them a ton, but they start doing homework on these kids at 14, 15, 16 years old. And so why do I bring it up? It is because I believe that Johnny Davis is being hurt because of the fact that he was hurt late in the season. In other words, you spend 5, 6, 7 years evaluating these kids. This kid was a late bloomer, came on late, had a great season. Then he gets hurt right before the Big Ten tournament, right before the NCAA tournament. He doesn't play well, and now he is tumbling down draft boards. For people who did not follow Wisconsin basketball religiously this year, here's what you need to know. Middle to the end of the season, Johnny Davis was neck and neck with Oscar Tshiebwe as the National Player of the Year, and some people had Johnny Davis late into the season. Then what ends up happening? He gets hurt like basically the last or second to last regular season game, one and done in the Big Ten tournament. NCAA tournament, he shoots 4 of 16 in a second-round loss to Iowa State, and now people are talking about him as like the 8th to 12th pick in this draft, whereas I think if he's just healthy, and I think if he balls out in the NCAA tournament like he had all year, we're talking about him right in that 4 to 7 range with Jaden Ivy, with Keegan Murray, with Shaedon Sharpe, all those guys. And so when I talk about a guy that I think can step in right away, that can get buckets, a guy that can just do everything offensively, Johnny Davis is it. And I think he's undervalued because I think he's going to go somewhere between like 7 and 11 or 12. And I think he's anywhere, he probably should be drafted somewhere in the 4 to 6 range. He's a player that, as I said, was phenomenal in terms of creating his own offense, carried a Wisconsin team to essentially a Big Ten regular season title, 20 points per game, 8 rebounds per game as a 6'4 guard. Didn't shoot the ball great from 3, but 31% overall, and he did all this as the focal point of his team's offense. Imagine him going to Detroit and playing off Cade Cunningham. Imagine him going to Sacramento and playing off of De'Aaron Fox. Imagine him going to Portland alongside Damian Lillard as Portland drafts at number 9 overall. Number 7 overall. Number 8, the New Orleans Pelicans. We know who they got. Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, Herb Jones. Imagine him going there. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I really like Johnny Davis. I really think he's undervalued. And to me, he is the most undervalued player in this draft. Question number 6. Who are some other undervalued players? I've talked about a lot of these guys, so I'll be quick. 1, Ben Matherin from Arizona. This was a guy, I talked about him on this show quite a bit, but I remember talking to someone on the old Arizona staff, not the staff that was here this past year, and they told me, this kid could have gone pro last year. He decides to come back. He knows that he's not ready, and he blossoms into a star. So 1, I love the self-awareness. 2, he was absolutely awesome as a sophomore at Arizona. 17 points per game, 37% from the field. Another guy that early in the year we were talking about as a National Player of the Year candidate. I mean, some of his games were incredible. 28 points against a really good Tennessee team, 30 points against a really good Illinois team. I think he's completely undervalued. I think he's going to be a really good pro. Really excited about Ben Matherin. Another guy's kind of the opposite perspective of Ben Matherin, a guy that evolved and turned himself into a star. That was Ben Matherin. This guy played a role. He will be a role player in the NBA, and I think sometimes we undersell the guy that wasn't the star in college because he played a specific role, but I think playing a specific role in this case is going to work out well, and that's Mark Williams at Duke. 7 feet, 245 pounds, 11 points, 7.5 rebounds per game, almost 3 blocks per game. He was a role player at Duke, and I think he's going to come into the NBA and play that exact same role. Super athletic, can guard in space. Offensively, he does not need plays run for him, which I think is a very important element of all this. And I'm really excited to see him play. I'm really excited to see him in the NBA. I think he's a modern big. I think we spend so much time talking about Paolo and Chet, or Chet down low and Paolo with Duke, that we forget how good this guy was. He played a key role. I thought at times he was the most important player for Duke, even more important than Paolo. Mark Williams is another guy that I believe is undervalued. Now let's get to the overvalued guys at number 7. Who are the most overvalued guys? The first guy is obvious, and we talked about him on last episode, and I don't need to belabor the point because I already did 20 minutes on him. It's Shaedon Sharpe. And if you missed my big Shaedon Sharpe speech last episode, go back and listen to it. But what stands out to me about Shaedon Sharpe is pretty straightforward. 1, we haven't seen him play any competitive basketball at all over the last probably year and a half. 2, it's what I talked about on Monday. We don't know why he didn't play competitive basketball. Is it because the adults in his life shut him down? Did Calipari not want him to play? Did he not feel as though he was ready? So 1, we don't know why he didn't play. But 2, here's the other part about it as well. This was a guy that we had questions about his competitive spirit as it was before the whole situation at Kentucky. And so he didn't have a great motor. He was a guy that we questioned his motor, and then he didn't play for a year, and nobody is totally sure why. So I understand the concerns about Shaedon Sharpe going into this draft. I understand why people like him. I understand why it only takes one team to take a risk. But I do understand why there are concerns about him as well, and why some people may just skip out on drafting him altogether. I think he's one of the most fascinating prospects we've ever had. I have no idea. As I said, it's only going to take one team. But what I would also finally say on Shaedon Sharpe that's worth considering, I was told by some people around Kentucky, like this was like early on in the draft process when it was that he might actually come back. There were some people that were like, even he knows he's not ready. And so you talk about a guy, competitive motor questions, didn't play, and there is buzz. And this is not like a Kentucky person trying to convince me to put it out there in public so that he'll be forced to come back. Like, this was somebody who had his best interest at heart that was really like, look, the kid wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to be that dude at Kentucky. And I'd be concerned if I was drafting him, that's all. The other big guy that I would say that I believe is a little bit overvalued, E.J. Liddell from Ohio State. So I'll just be honest. I just don't get this one, okay? So E.J. Liddell, for people who did not watch a ton of Ohio State, first of all, declared for the draft last year, 6'7", averaged 19 points, 8 rebounds per game, and shot 37% from 3. I want to give this kid credit because to his credit, he basically came to college as a back-to-the-basket player. After last season, he declared for the NBA draft. And NBA people basically told him, look, you're 6'7", you can't be a low-post guy, you got to stretch it out, you got to be able to shoot threes, you got to be versatile, and he did all that. But at the same time, this is part of me being the college basketball guy. I actually watched all of his games, and I just never watched him and said, that's a top 20 kid, yet he's being projected as a top 20 guy in this NBA draft. I just don't see it. I don't see what he does at an elite level. He doesn't have elite size. He doesn't have elite length. He doesn't have elite athleticism. He's 6'7", not a great ball handler, by the way. He's not a guy that grew up at 6'7" as a wing and a guard. He's a guy that grew up as a low post player and has developed into more of a wing player, so he's not a great ball handler. He's a great shooter, but again, part of it is like that Jabari Smith, more of the, he can catch and shoot, but he's not creating. He's not getting the ball at half court, ripping, crossing two dudes over and pulling up for three. And so I'll just be honest, like I don't wish ill will on anybody. I hope he has a great NBA career. He's the one that I don't get it. No elite size, no elite athleticism, kind of a low post player that's learning how to play the wing. I don't see it. I don't get why he's a top 20 pick, but a lot of people seem to have him that high. All right, number 8. Let's get to the prospect that I don't know what to do with. The prospect that I just have no idea what to do with. That is A.J. Griffin from Duke. A.J. Griffin is a fascinating case study, okay? And part of it is unfortunate, but junior year he gets hurt. First of all, top 5 recruit in the 2021 high school class, basically since they started ranking the class. Really, really, really good prospect. But his junior year, he gets hurt. His senior year, he doesn't play because of COVID. His dad is an NBA assistant. He actually just goes works out with NBA teams. Gets hurt at the beginning of the year at Duke, and by the time he comes back with Duke, all the roles are pretty established. Paolo's the guy. Mark Williams is the energy rim runner. Jeremy Roach and Trevor Keels are the guys with the ball in their hands. And A.J. Griffin just kind of becomes the guy that stands in the corner and knocks down a bunch of threes. And to his credit, he was really good at it. This past year at Duke, A.J. Griffin, here are the stats on A.J. Griffin. 10 points per game, 45% three-point shooting. And it's not as though he didn't barely attempt any threes. More than half of his shots came from behind the three-point line. And so why I don't know what to do with him is because it's pretty straightforward. One, on a positive side, every team needs elite shooting, and if all he ever becomes is just a really good standstill shooter, he can find a role in this league. I just don't know if he's capable of doing more or if anybody's going to want him to do more. And if he is only a three-point shooter, I don't know. I feel like you can get that in the middle of the first round, end of the first round, second round, whatever. And that's where the confusion comes in for me, because what is he actually capable of? And then on top of that, here's the other thing too. He's a baby. I could be mistaken. I think he's actually the youngest player in this draft. He is still 18 years old. He'll be 19 in August. So remember, you have to be 19 in the year of the draft, 2021, to be eligible. He is one of the youngest players in this draft. And so I sit there and I say, I'm overanalyzing him, but he averaged 10 points a game, shot 45% from three as an 18-year-old freshman at Duke. And is it fair to compare him to players that in some cases are 2, 3, 4 years older? Ochai Agbaji, for example, from Kansas, is a 22-year-old player that played 4 years of college basketball, plays the same position, does essentially the same things. If A.J. Griffin had 3 more years of college basketball to catch up with Ochai Agbaji, would I feel differently about A.J. Griffin than I would, would A.J. Griffin be the player that Ochai Agbaji would be? And I think he would be. And so I bring it all up to just say he is the one player I don't know what to do with. On the one hand, he really only showed one skill, the ability to hit three-pointers. On the other hand, he was super young. It's a skill that everybody needs. And who's to say that he can't get better? He's one where I could just see him for the next 10 years just being a three-point shooter and being a really good role player on an NBA team. But I could also see the scenario where he develops a complete game and becomes like a multi-time All-Star and becomes really, really good. Let's wrap up. 2 more quick things on the 2022 NBA Draft. Number 1, and this is my 9th thing. Which player has the biggest boom-bust potential? I think A.J. Griffin is probably there. But what I would say about A.J. Griffin is that outside of A.J. Griffin, the guy that seems obvious to me is Jaden Ivy. And I talked about this following the NBA Draft Lottery. But Jaden Ivey's a really interesting cat, right? Because he's another one. All the physical tools are there. Jumps out of the gym, improved three-point shot, averaged 17.5 points per game. And so I'm not dumb enough to call a guy that might be the best athlete in the draft, 17 points per game, major college basketball, can shoot threes. I'm not going to call him a bust. I'm not going to project that he's a bust either. Same time, keep in mind with this. He seemed to get worse as the season went on. Even though he's kind of a lead guard, doesn't really make people better. 3 assists, 2 turnovers per game. Finally, he disappeared in some really big games, in some really big moments. And I talked about this after the lottery, but that St. Peter's game, is the perfect example. If you remember, Purdue lost to St. Peter's in the opening round of the NCAA tournament. He disappeared. 9 points, 33% from the field. He finished that game shooting 1 of 6 from 3, 2 assists, 6 turnovers against St. Peter's. Dude, if you're a top 5 pick, which he's being projected to be, take over that game. St. Peter's barely has any guys that are high major players, let alone NBA caliber players. I just don't know what to make of him. I would probably stay away. I don't love him, but I could see the scenario where he's really good. Finally, let's wrap a couple second-round steals. Give you a couple guys that I think are going to be taken in the second round that I really, really, really like. First one, Walker Kessler from Auburn. He may sneak into the first round, but he was the National Defensive Player of the Year. Another guy that played a role this year, which I think when you're in the second round, you're going to be a role player. You're not going to be a star. Learn your role, earn your role, and star in your role. Well, Walker Kessler did that even this past year at Auburn. 11 points per game, 8 rebounds per game, 4.5 blocks per game as the National Player of the Year. Love Walker Kessler. If he falls to the second round, grab him when you can. Speaking of which, another second rounder from my alma mater, UConn, Tyrese Martin. I always liked Tyrese Martin. I didn't understand why people weren't higher on him. Well, NBA draft process starts and he becomes one of the breakout stars. 13.5 points per game, 7.5 rebounds per game as a 6'7 guard. A player that shot 43% from 3. And another guy that really became a role player. RJ Cole was the guy with the ball in his hands. He was the star. Adama Sanogo, they ran offense, threw him down low. And Tyrese Martin still figured out a way to average 14 points and 8 rebounds per game. I really like him. I think he's a second rounder. I think he's going to be a steal for somebody. Keep it going. Dalen Terry, I've talked about him a ton. I don't think he's going in the second round. I think he's going in the top 25 or so. And it wouldn't totally shock me if he goes in the top 20. Somebody at Pangos All-American Camp told me, be ready to be stunned with where he ends up. Dalen Terry from Arizona is one. And those, I think, are the big guys. Orlando Robinson from Fresno, really good player. 20-9 guy at Fresno State. I've known Orlando since he was probably about 16 years old, junior in high school. He went to high school not far from me here in Los Angeles. Got to know him well. Great kid, and I think he'll be a great NBA